For 6 years, every freight wagon and mail coach between Coulter's Bend and the mining town of Harshaw crossed through the southern valley of Dry Spine Ridge. Stay with me, because what happened next changed the map of that territory for good. The southern valley was wide, flat, and soft-bottomed, easy on horses, easy on wheels, easy on the eyes. It was the obvious route, the one investors pointed to at town meetings, the one surveyors drew thick black lines across, the one the newly chartered Territorial Stagecoach Company stamped onto its brochures in the autumn of 1882. Nobody talked about what happened to the valley every April. Nobody except Norah Prescott. Norah had come west from Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, in the spring of 1876, riding alongside her husband Thomas on a cattle drive bound for the Montana grasslands. She was 22 years old, narrow-shouldered but hard-armed, with sun-darkened skin and hands already roughened from years of her mother's dairy farm. Thomas was a good man, quiet, careful, the kind of drover who checked his cinch strap twice and his water barrels 3 times. He taught Norah to read terrain the way some men read scripture, slowly, closely, and with suspicion of anything too easy. Thomas had a way of reading land that Norah had never encountered before she met him. His father had been a surveyor for the railroad in Illinois, and Thomas had grown up with a chain and a compass before he ever sat a horse. He could look at a hillside and tell you where the water would go when it rained. He could study a riverbed in August and know, within a foot, where the flood line would be in April. It wasn't magic. It was attention, the slow, patient accumulation of details that most people walked right past. He taught Norah all of it. On long cattle drives through Wyoming and Montana, while other drovers played cards around the fire, Thomas would spread a rough map across his knees and trace drainage lines with his finger. "See this?" he would say, pointing to a wide basin drawn in pencil. "Looks easy, looks flat. But look at the soil. It's clay. Water sits on clay like a plate. It doesn't go anywhere." Then he would move his finger to a narrow line cutting between 2 ridges. "Now look here. Stone, gravel. That corridor might be tight, but when the rain comes, it sheds water in hours. The ground holds firm when everything else turns to soup." Norah remembered those lessons the way some people remembered prayers. Precisely, completely, and in the voice of the person who first spoke them. Thomas died in the winter of 1879. Typhoid. It took him in 11 days. The fever came on a Tuesday, and by the following Friday, he was gone. He was 31 years old. At the end, his hands were burning hot, but his voice was steady. He looked at Norah and said, "You know everything I know. Don't let anyone tell you different." She held his hand until it cooled. Norah buried him on a hillside overlooking the Yellowstone, wrapped in his own bedroll, with his boots still on because that was how he would have wanted it. She drove 3 fence posts into the frozen ground to mark the spot. It took her 4 hours. Her hands bled through her gloves and froze to the post-hole digger, and she did not stop. She did not leave Montana. She sold the small herd Thomas had built, 47 head of shorthorn cattle, and used the money to buy 80 acres of scrubland near the settlement of Coulter's Bend. The land was poor for ranching, rocky, wind-scoured, but it had a creek that ran year-round and a stand of lodgepole pine that could be milled for fence posts. Norah didn't need lush grass. She needed a foothold. She built a cabin that first year, 12 by 16 feet, chinked with river clay, roofed with split pine shakes. A shaggy gray dog appeared at her doorstep in November, half-starved and wary, with amber eyes that watched everything and trusted nothing. She fed him scraps of elk, jerky. By December, he slept at the foot of her cot and growled at wind gusts as if they were intruders. She called him Flint. Flint went everywhere Norah went. He sat beside her when she mended harness leather. He trotted alongside her roan mare, Grit, when she rode into Coulter's Bend for flour and coffee. He lay beneath her chair at the general store while men talked past her as though she were part of the furniture. Norah listened more than she spoke. And what she heard over the next 3 years was the same story every spring. The Southern Valley flooded. It happened the same way each time. The snow in the high peaks began to melt in late March. By mid-April, runoff poured down through a dozen unnamed creeks and gathered in the wide, flat basin of the Southern Valley. The ground there was clay-heavy, dense, slow to drain, stubborn with water. Within 2 weeks, the road became a canal. Wagons sank to their axles. Horses floundered in mud that sucked at their hooves like wet mortar. Freight shipments stalled. Mail routes detoured 50 miles south through rough country that added 3 days to a journey. Every year, the merchants of Coulter's Bend cursed the flooding. Every year, they said someone ought to do something about it. And every year, by June, the water receded, the road dried out, and they forgot. Norah did not forget. She had ridden cattle drives through country like Dry Spine Ridge. She had watched her husband study passes the way a carpenter studies grain, looking not at the surface but at what lay beneath. Thomas had once told her, during a rainstorm that turned a broad Wyoming meadow into a shallow lake, that the safest ground in a flood was often the narrowest. Stone drained fast. Rock corridors shed water like a pitched roof. Wide valleys collected it. Narrow passes refused it. She remembered this, and she studied the map. The northern pass through Dry Spine Ridge was everything the Southern Valley was not. It ran for roughly 2 miles between walls of pale sandstone that rose 40 to 60 feet on either side. The corridor was narrow, barely 18 feet across at its tightest point, widening to perhaps 30 feet in the broader stretches. The floor was bare stone and compacted gravel, scoured clean by centuries of wind. No timber, no grass, no water except what ran off the walls during rain and vanished into cracks within hours. To any sensible investor, it was worthless. But to Norah, looking at that map in the dim light of her cabin with Flint curled at her feet, it was the answer to a question no one else was asking. The Territorial Stagecoach Company held its land auction on March 14th, 1883, in the back room of the Coulter's Bend Savings and Trust. 27 men attended. Norah was the only woman. She sat in the last row, wearing a clean cotton dress she had pressed that morning with a flat iron heated on her wood stove. Flint waited outside, tied loosely to the hitching post, watching the door with those amber eyes. The auctioneer, a thin, cheerful man named Lyle Beecham, worked through the parcels in order of assessed value. The Southern Valley corridor went first. 3 bidders competed. The final price was $1,240, a significant sum for raw land in that territory. The northern pass came up last. Beecham read the description with the tone of a man clearing his throat. Lot 14, Northern Corridor, Dry Spine Ridge, approximately 2 miles of stone passage, no arable land, no timber rights, no water access, minimum bid, $40. Silence. A few men shifted in their chairs. Someone coughed. $40, Norah said. Every head turned. Beecham looked up from his ledger. Ma'am? $40 for lot 14. He waited. No one else spoke. Sold, Beecham said, and wrote her name in the book. The laughter started before she reached the door. She bought a crack in the rocks. That was Garrett Harlan, a cattle broker who owned 400 acres of good valley grass and liked to remind people of it. Can't farm stone. Frank Jessup, the freight operator, shaking his head with a grin that was more pity than cruelty. No one will travel that way. Not when the valley road's right there. Jonas Peck, who ran the general store and considered himself an authority on commerce because he sold both nails and whiskey. Norah heard every word. She did not answer. She untied Flint, mounted Grit, and rode home. That night she sat at her table with the deed spread flat before her and a stub of pencil in her hand. She drew a rough sketch of the past from memory, the narrows, the wider bends, the places where loose stone had collected at the base of the walls. She made notes in small, precise handwriting. Eastern wall, overhang at approximately 400 yards. Good shelter. Floor rises 3 feet over middle quarter mile. Natural drainage. Tightest point near south entrance. Needs widening by 4 to 6 feet. Flint watched her from the floor, his chin resting on his paws. "They think I'm foolish," Norah said quietly. Flint blinked his amber eyes. "That's fine," she said. "The rock doesn't care what they think." Norah began work on the pass in late March. She rode out each morning before dawn, Grit picking her way along the ridge trail with the patience of a horse who had long ago accepted that her rider would ask difficult things of her. Flint trotted alongside, nose to the wind, ears turning at every sound. The work was brutal. Norah started at the southern entrance, where a fan of loose rubble had accumulated over decades of freeze-thaw cycles. She cleared it by hand, prying stones loose with an iron bar, levering boulders with a timber fulcrum, loading smaller rocks into a canvas drag she pulled behind Grit. She worked 10-hour days. Her hands bled through her gloves. Her shoulders ached in ways she hadn't known shoulders could ache. She lost 8 pounds in the first 2 weeks, weight she couldn't afford to lose. At night, she soaked her hands in warm water and wrapped them in strips of cotton soaked with tallow, the way her mother had done back in Pennsylvania when the dairy works split her knuckles open every winter. Flint stayed close. He sat on the highest nearby rock and watched the corridor in both directions, his ears rotating like weather vanes. When Norah stopped to eat, cold biscuits, dried beef, water from a canteen, he sat beside her and pressed his flank against her leg. He never begged. He just stayed near. By mid-April, she had cleared the first 300 yards. She moved to the narrows, the 18-foot bottleneck that would stop any wagon wider than a buckboard. Here she used a technique her father had taught her on the Pennsylvania farm, drilling shallow holes into the stone face with a hand auger, filling them with water, and letting the freeze-thaw cycle of cold spring nights crack the rock along natural seam lines. It was slow. Some mornings she arrived to find the stone unchanged. Other mornings, a slab the size of a tabletop had broken free and lay on the corridor floor, ready to be dragged out. She wore out 3 auger bits in 6 weeks. She sharpened them herself on a whetstone she kept in her saddlebag, working the edge in long, even strokes the way Thomas had shown her. When the 3rd bit finally gave out, she rode to Coulter's Bend and bought 2 more from Jonas Peck's store. Peck looked at the worn-down metal and shook his head. "You drilling into that ridge again, Mrs. Prescott?" "I am. It's just rock up there. Rock doesn't change." Norah set 2 silver dollars on the counter. "It does," she said, "just slowly." By May, she had widened the narrows to 24 feet. She built low retaining walls along the stretches where seasonal runoff cut shallow channels across the pass floor. She used the stone she had already cleared, flat pieces laid dry, no mortar, stacked 18 inches high in gentle curves that directed water toward the walls rather than pooling in the center. It was simple engineering. It was the kind of work that looked like nothing until you understood what it prevented. The men of Coulter's Bend watched her come and go. Some shook their heads. Some made jokes she wasn't meant to hear, but always did. Prescott's building a road to nowhere. Woman's got more stubbornness than sense. She'll tire of it by summer. She did not tire of it. The winter of 1883 to 84 was unremarkable. Cold, but not brutal. Snow fell in the usual amounts. The Southern Valley Road froze hard and held, and wagons crossed without trouble through December and January and into February. The skeptics felt confirmed. See? Jonas Peck said to anyone who would listen. Valley Road's fine. Always has been. Norah said nothing. She spent the winter mending her cabin roof, splitting firewood, and studying her notes. She calculated that by spring she would need to reinforce 3 more drainage points and smooth a 30-yard stretch where exposed bedrock created an uneven surface that would jar wagon axles. She waited. The spring of 1884 came late and came hard. The snowpack that year was the heaviest anyone in the territory could remember. Old-timers, the ones who had been there since the 1860s, said the drifts in the high country were 12 to 15 feet deep by March. Norah rode up to the ridge on the last day of the month and stood at the southern entrance to her pass, looking out at the white peaks to the west. The snow line was lower than she had ever seen it. The air smelled like iron and wet stone. "It's coming," she said to Flint, who stood beside her with his nose to the wind. "And it's going to be bad." She spent the first 2 weeks of April reinforcing every drainage wall in the pass. She relaid the weakest sections, 40 feet of low stone wall near the midpoint, where last winter's frost had shifted some of the base stones. She cleared 3 small rock falls from the corridor floor. She checked the narrows for any new cracks in the widened section and found one, a hairline fracture running diagonally across the eastern wall, that she stabilized with a wedge of fitted stone and a prayer. When the warming finally came, it came fast. 3 days of temperatures above 50 degrees in the 3rd week of April. The sky went from winter gray to a hot, hazy blue that belonged to June, not spring. The melt was catastrophic. Water poured down every drainage. Creeks that normally ran ankle-deep became waist-high torrents. The sound of it was everywhere, a constant low roar from the mountains, as if the land itself was exhaling. And the Southern Valley, that wide, flat, clay-bottomed basin that looked so inviting on a dry summer day, filled like a bathtub. By April 22nd, the road was under 2 feet of standing water and still rising. Frank Jessup had a freight wagon loaded with mining equipment, 1,600 pounds of stamp mill parts bound for Harshaw. It entered the valley at dawn. By noon, the team was chest-deep in mud-brown water, and the wagon had settled to its bed rails. It took 8 men and a second team of horses to drag it free. The shipment was delayed 11 days. The mail coach tried 3 times to cross in the last week of April. Twice it turned back. The 3rd time, the driver, a young man named Colby Walsh, pushed through and nearly lost both horses when the road gave way beneath their hooves into a sinkhole disguised by muddy water. Walsh made it through, but he refused to cross again until the water dropped. The Territorial Stagecoach Company sent a representative from Helena, a man named Aldous Pruitt, who wore a gray suit and carried a leather portfolio and spoke in the careful language of someone accustomed to explaining bad news to investors. He stood at the edge of the flooded valley on April 28th and said, very quietly, "We need another route." Garrett Harlan, who happened to be present, said nothing. Jonas Peck said nothing. Everyone knew who owned the Northern Pass. Pruitt rode out to Norah's cabin the following morning. Flint announced him from 200 yards, a low, steady growl that wasn't hostile but wasn't welcoming either. Grit stood in the corral, watching with her ears forward. Norah came out, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She had been making bread. "Mrs. Prescott," Pruitt said, dismounting carefully, "I represent the Territorial Stagecoach Company. I believe you own the northern corridor through Dry Spine Ridge." "I do. We would like to discuss purchasing that corridor." Norah looked at him for a long moment. The morning sun caught the pale stone of the distant ridge behind him. "It's not for sale," she said. Pruitt blinked. "Ma'am, I'm authorized to offer a very fair." "I said it's not for sale." She invited him inside for coffee. She served it black, in a tin cup with a slice of the bread she had just baked. Flint lay by the stove and watched the visitor with unblinking amber eyes. Norah explained what she was offering instead. Controlled access, a toll road, 25 cents per horse, 50 cents per wagon, $1 per freight team of 4 or more animals. Written in contract, published rates, no negotiation. She would maintain the pass herself. She would keep it clear of rockfall, repair the drainage walls after every storm season, and guarantee passage for any vehicle that met the width requirement of her corridor. Pruitt studied the terms she had written out on a single sheet of paper in that same small, precise handwriting. "This is very reasonable," he said, sounding surprised. "It's meant to be," Norah said. "I'm not trying to get rich off a flood. I'm trying to build something that lasts." Pruitt signed a preliminary agreement that afternoon. The formal contract was executed in Helena 3 weeks later. The first stagecoach crossed through Norah's Pass on May 6, 1884. The driver, Colby Walsh, the same young man who had nearly lost his horses in the valley flood, pulled up at the southern entrance and looked at the narrow stone walls rising on either side. "Ma'am," he said to Norah, who stood at the entrance with Flint beside her, "I've been driving coaches for 3 years, and I've never seen a road made of nothing but rock look this good." The floor was clean. The drainage walls directed any surface water to the edges. The narrows, now widened to 24 feet, admitted the coach with clearance to spare. The stone was firm and dry beneath the wheels. Walsh made the crossing in 42 minutes. When he reached the northern exit, he turned and looked back through the corridor, those high, pale walls catching the late afternoon light, and tipped his hat. Word spread. Within a month, every freight operator between Coulter's Bend and Harshaw had switched to the Northern Pass. Cattle drives followed. The mail coach added Norah's route to its permanent schedule. Riders traveling alone preferred the stone corridor, even in dry months, because the footing was reliable and the walls blocked the worst of the territorial winds. Norah collected tolls from a small booth she built at the southern entrance, a simple structure of stacked stone with a timber roof and a wooden shelf where she kept her ledger. Flint lay beside it every day, watching each wagon pass with the calm attention of a creature who understood that this place mattered. By midsummer 1884, the useless crack in the rocks was handling more traffic than the Southern Valley Road ever had, even in its best months. The reactions came slowly, then all at once. Frank Jessup was the first. He rode up to the toll booth one morning in June with a load of dry goods bound for Harshaw. He paid his $1, then sat on the wagon bench and looked down at Norah. His face had the weathered, tired expression of a man who had spent the past month watching his livelihood sink into mud. "I said you were building a road to nowhere," he said. I was wrong, and I said it loud enough for half the town to hear, so I figure I owe you saying this loud enough too." Norah nodded. "That'll be $1, Mr. Jessup." He almost smiled. "Already paid it." "I know," Norah said. "Just making sure you remember." Jessup came through the pass every week after that. He never failed to tip his hat, and he never once complained about the toll. Jonas Peck came through the following week. He didn't apologize directly. That wasn't his way. But he brought Norah a sack of coffee beans and a new flour sifter, and he told her that if she ever needed supplies on account, her credit was good at his store. He stood at the toll booth for a moment, looking at the stone walls rising on either side, and said, very quietly, "I sold you those auger bits and thought you were wasting your money. Turns out you were the only one spending it right." Norah thanked him for the coffee and said nothing more. Garrett Harlan was last. He rode through the pass on a hot July afternoon, alone on a tall bay gelding. He stopped at the toll booth, paid his quarter, and looked at Norah with an expression she had seen before on the faces of men who were not accustomed to being wrong. His jaw worked for a moment, as if the words were stones he had to roll aside before they'd come. "Mrs. Prescott," he said. "Mr. Harlan." That was a shrewd piece of thinking. "It wasn't shrewd," Norah said. "It was just paying attention." Harlan tipped his hat and rode on. Norah watched him go. Flint yawned and set his chin back on his paws. She scratched behind his ears. "Paying attention," she said again quietly, to no one in particular. The years that followed proved Norah right in ways even she hadn't fully anticipated. The Southern Valley flooded 5 more times in the next decade, in 1886, 1888, 1890, 1893, and 1895. Each time, Norah's Pass carried the full burden of traffic between the two towns without interruption. Each time, the stone held. Each time, the drainage wall she had built directed the runoff exactly as she had designed. By 1890, Norah had earned enough from the toll road to expand her holdings. She bought another 40 acres adjacent to the southern entrance and built a small way station, a stone building with a stable, a water trough fed by a spring she had located by watching where moss grew on the rock face, and 2 rooms where travelers could rest or wait out weather. She charged fair rates. She kept the place clean. Flint's daughter, a gray-coated pup with the same amber eyes, whom Norah named Ember, guarded the way station the way her father guarded the toll booth. Grit grew old and was retired to the corral, where she spent her days standing in the sun with the dignity of a horse who had done her share. Norah bought a young dun gelding she called Stone, because he was steady and unmovable and never startled at anything. In 1892, the Territorial Stagecoach Company formally designated the Northern Pass as the primary route through Dry Spine Ridge. The Southern Valley Road was downgraded to seasonal use only. The company offered to buy the pass again. Norah declined again. "I built it," she said. "I'll keep it." By the turn of the century, Norah Prescott was 56 years old. Her hair had gone silver white. Her hands were knotted and scarred from 20 years of working stone. She walked with a slight limp, a legacy of a fall from a scaffold while repairing a retaining wall in 1897. But she still rode out to the pass every week to inspect the corridor, check the drainage, and clear any debris that winter storms had shaken loose from the walls above. She had hired 2 men by then, brothers named Cal and Henry Dunmore, steady young ranchers who had grown up watching Norah work and had asked, without mockery, if she would teach them how the pass was maintained. They had come to her door on a cold October morning in 1898, hats in hand, with the earnest, slightly nervous look of men who were about to ask a woman for something they weren't sure she'd give. Mrs. Prescott, Cal said, we've watched you work that pass for 15 years. We've come through it 100 times. And we've been talking, Henry and me, and we'd like to learn how it's done. Not just the clearing and the wall building, all of it. How you read the stone, how you know where the water goes, how you keep it holding year after year. Norah looked at them for a long time. She saw in their faces something she recognized. The same quiet curiosity Thomas had carried. The same willingness to look closely at what other people walked past. Come back tomorrow at dawn, she said. Wear boots you don't mind ruining. She taught them everything. Where the seam lines ran in the sandstone. How to read a crack in the wall to tell if it was stable or ready to shed. How to slope a drainage wall so water moved without carving. How to listen to the stone after a hard freeze. The faint ticking sound of expanding ice that meant a slab might break loose within days. How to feel the floor of the corridor with your feet through your boot soles and know whether the gravel beneath was packed firm or hollowing out from underneath. The stone will do most of the work, she told them, standing in the corridor on a cool September morning with Ember's granddaughter, another gray dog, this one named Dust, sitting at her feet. Your job is to not get in its way. Cal nodded. Henry wrote it down in a small notebook he carried in his vest pocket. Norah smiled. She recognized that notebook. She had carried one just like it years ago, when the pass was still a crack in the rocks, and the only person who believed in it was a widow with bleeding hands and a stubborn dog. Knowledge is not like gold, she thought. Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger. Norah Prescott died on March 3rd, 1911, in the stone way station she had built at the mouth of her pass. She was 67 years old. The cause was pneumonia, the same patient, grinding illness that took so many on the frontier. She went quietly, in the night, with Dust's great-granddaughter curled at the foot of her bed and Stone's grandson standing in the corral outside, breath steaming in the cold March air. Cal Dunmore found her at dawn. He removed his hat and stood in the doorway for a long time. The funeral was held 2 days later. More than 100 people attended. Ranchers, freight drivers, mail carriers, merchants from both Coulter's Bend and Harshaw. Colby Walsh, now gray-haired and retired from coaching, rode 40 miles to be there. They buried her on the hillside above the southern entrance to the pass, where the pale sandstone walls were visible in both directions. Someone, no one was sure who, carved into the rock face beside her grave a single line. She saw what the stone could do. The pass continued to operate. Cal and Henry Dunmore maintained it for another 30 years, then passed the knowledge to their own children. The toll was eventually removed when the territory became a state, and the route was absorbed into the public road system. But the corridor itself, those high pale walls, that firm stone floor, those carefully sloped drainage walls, endured. It endures still. And sometimes, if you ride through on a spring morning when the meltwater is pouring down the mountains and the valleys below are flooded and impassable, you can feel it. The dry, steady ground beneath your wheels, the stone doing exactly what it was always meant to do. Holding, the way Norah always said it would. Because the narrow path no one wanted was the only one that held when everything else washed away. And the woman who saw that, who bought a crack in the rocks when everyone laughed, who cleared it with her own bleeding hands, who built something patient and permanent while the world chased what looked easy. She understood a truth that the ridge had known for 10,000 years. What endures is not what is wide. it is what is firm.